Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing and complicated scandals in recent American history. And we're going to be guided by the incredible work of Nick Bryant. He's a journalist who has really dedicated his career to fighting for vulnerable kids, and he was the one who chased this terrifying story when all the major media outlets were just too scared to touch it. The result was his book, The Franklin Scandal, and believe me, it uncovers a chilling nexus of money, power, and truly horrific abuse.
So, it all kicks off with a question that honestly sounds like something out of a movie. How on earth does a local credit union going bankrupt in Omaha, Nebraska back in the 80s somehow spiral into this massive scandal that pulls in the White House, whispers of the CIA, and a cover-up so huge it's almost hard to wrap your head around? Well, let's get into it.
At the very center of this storm is one man, Lawrence E. King. And no, not the talk show host. This Larry King was a super charismatic and powerful guy in Omaha. He came from humble beginnings, son of a meat packer, but he was incredibly ambitious. He was a talented singer, an Air Force vet, and he carefully crafted this image of himself as a successful Republican businessman, a real pillar of the community.
And King wasn't just some local big shot. We're talking about a guy who was singing for President Reagan at the Republican National Convention. He was throwing these unbelievably lavish parties for the Republican elite, rubbing elbows with cabinet secretaries. He had, for all intents and purposes, bought himself a seat at the table in the absolute highest circles of power.
So the obvious question is, where did all the money for this come from? Well, it turns out he looted nearly $40 million from the Franklin Credit Union, the very institution he was supposed to be running. And this wasn't just, bad accounting. It was a full-blown Ponzi scheme, all designed to fuel his rocket ship ride to the top. I mean, just look at these numbers. In a little over a year, his spending was just off the charts. Over $1 million on credit cards alone, hundreds of thousands on limos and flowers. He was living this absolutely insane life of luxury, all by treating the credit union like it was his own personal, never-ending ATM.
If this was just a story about financial fraud, it would be pretty shocking on its own. But as investigators started to pull back the curtain on all the financial crimes, they stumbled onto something so much darker, something truly evil, lurking just beneath the surface.
And this is where the story takes a nosedive into an absolute nightmare. The quiet whispers about financial trouble suddenly turned into deafening screams of unimaginable abuse. Young victims, kids, started coming forward with stories that were so horrific they just didn't seem possible. The stories they told were just chillingly consistent. Victims, like a young woman named Eulise Washington, described this sophisticated, organized network. They said King was flying children on private jets to these parties in big cities, where they were abused by incredibly wealthy and powerful men. They even claimed that kids from the world-famous Boys Town orphanage were being systematically preyed upon.
So you have to ask, how could a network like this even exist, let alone thrive? Well, the book makes a powerful case that it's because King's protection wasn't just local. That very web of powerful connections he'd spent so much money building in Washington, D.C. was acting as his shield, giving him the cover he needed to operate without fear.
This timeline here really just paints the picture, doesn't it? From singing at the '84 convention to hosting parties where you'd find names like future Justice Clarence Thomas on the invite list, he was organizing huge galas with political heavyweights like Jack Kemp and even a former president. These weren't just casual friends. He was a serious player in their world.
Now, as a few courageous people back in Nebraska started to actually investigate these horrifying allegations, the danger level shot through the roof. It turns out anyone who got too close to the truth, anyone who threatened to expose this network, well, they started ending up dead under very suspicious circumstances.
The key figure we need to talk about here is Gary Cardori. He was the lead investigator for a state committee that was looking into both the Franklin collapse and these abuse allegations. And from everything we know, he was relentless, he was fearless, and he was getting dangerously close to blowing the lid off this entire conspiracy.
And then, a truly chilling pattern starts to form. First, back in '86, a young guy named Charlie Rogers, who had financial ties to King, ends up dead. It's ruled a suicide, but he had just told his family he was afraid for his life. Then, a few years later, in 1990, Gary Cardori's private plane explodes in midair, killing him and his 8-year-old son.
So, you've got the official story on one hand, and then you've got the facts on the other. And they just don't line up.
Roger's death is called a suicide, but there's no note, the door was unlocked. It's weird. Cardadori's crash is called an accident, but the NTSB's own report couldn't say for sure, and we know for a fact that a state senator had warned him his life was in danger.
These were Gary Caradori's last words to his boss, Senator Schmit. We got them by the short hairs. He was convinced he had the evidence. He was right on the verge of breaking the whole thing open. And then he was silenced, permanently.
After Caradori's death, something incredible happens. The entire narrative flips on its head. Suddenly, the official investigation wasn't about a powerful child abuse ring anymore. The focus shifted entirely onto the victims themselves, who were now being accused of making the whole thing up, of perpetrating a massive, malicious hoax.
And this was the moment that changed everything. A key victim, Troy Boner, goes on national television on a CBS 48-hour special and takes it all back. He says everything was a lie, that the investigator, the late Gary Caradori, had coached him to make it all up for money. Just like that, overnight, the public perception of the scandal completely changed.
The legal system then came down like a ton of bricks on the accusers. Another central victim, Alicia Owen, refused to back down, refused to recount her story, and she was just hammered with a whole slew of perjury charges. I mean, look at this. She was facing the possibility of spending decades, maybe even the rest of her life in prison, all for just sticking to her story.
And that was the official end of it. A grand jury came out and declared the entire child abuse scandal a hoax. Larry King was never charged with a single thing related to child abuse. The victims, they were the ones who got indicted. The system completely cleared the powerful and condemned the powerless.
But as Nick Bryant's book makes crystal clear, that official story was nowhere near the whole story. The hoax conclusion just left this trail of really disturbing, unanswered questions that point to a conspiracy of silence way bigger than anyone could have imagined.
The book just leaves you wrestling with these huge questions. Like, why were thousands of documents in a related case in D.C. sealed by a judge? Was a major figure in that case actually a CIA asset running a blackmail ring for intelligence agencies? Why did the national media suddenly pivot from reporting on abuse to aggressively pushing this hoax story? And maybe the most disturbing question of all, why does the book lay out evidence that the FBI itself might have actively sabotaged the investigation? And we'll end with this really powerful thought from the author himself. The Franklin scandal isn't just some story about terrible crimes that happened a long time ago. It's a cautionary tale about the nature of power. It's a warning that the very institutions we're taught to trust to protect us can sometimes be used to bury the truth and protect the guilty. What does it mean for all of us when fiction can be spun into fact and fact can be spun right back into fiction? That's the question that this story leaves us with.